Hey everyone, this is Dave here with a look at Battlefield 1. So here we've got the campaign running on the PC using ultra settings at 1080p, and as you can see it's an incredible looking game, boasting complex visual effects, and here we're running at high frame rates too. And that's the question, just what does it take to get the game running at 60 frames per second? Well, in this case we're using a PC kitted out with a Skylake i5 paired with the GTX 1060 and a Radeon RX 480. These are popular mid-range cards that pack quite a lot of performance for the price. And as you can see here, for the most part neither card has any trouble at hitting a solid 60 FPS. However, in scenes where both GPUs are heavily taxed, particularly when there are lots of alpha effects on screen, then we do see metrics drop below the desired 60 FPS line on the GTX 1060, falling into the low 50s, whereas the RX 480, well, that manages to stay above the threshold to maintain a solid 60 frames per second. But outside of these moments, a solid 60 FPS is basically assured. In fact, we often see frame rates well above that level, over 100 FPS at times, and that essentially opens up the possibility of running at even higher resolutions than 1080p, though perhaps not while achieving a locked 60 FPS. And that's a great level of performance to see from a mid-range GPU. But then again, perhaps it's not so surprising. The Frostbite engine is specifically tailored towards hitting 60 FPS, and it's proven to be very scalable in the past as well. One thing that does remain familiar though is the performance differential between Nvidia and AMD cards with Frostbite titles. Here we're running the game using DirectX 12, and as you can see, the AMD card does have a considerable advantage. Now this does vary from scene to scene, but we're looking at anything between 5 to up to 15 frames per second here. Now we're running at 1080p, this extra headroom actually comes in very handy on AMD cards, as it actually allows us to avoid the drops below 60 frames per second that we see on the GTX 1060. And indeed this extra level of performance is also going to help when running above 1080p resolutions. Of course, the game supports both DirectX 11 and DX12, and as we've seen before, GPUs from both manufacturers perform very differently depending on which API you choose. So here's a look at the GTX 1060 with DX11 on the left and DX12 on the right. And yeah, you're seeing this right, we're actually getting high levels of performance with DirectX 11. Now on the one hand this is a little surprising to see given that DirectX 12 is supposed to reduce CPU overhead and thus give us higher frame rates, but that's not what we're seeing here. So what's going on? Well, typically Nvidia's DirectX 11 driver is a lot more efficient than AMD's, and judging by performance here it still seems like their DX11 efficiency is higher than that of DX12, meaning we generally get a better experience when using the older API. Of course, when moving on to AMD cards, the opposite is true, and actually we see a massive uptick in performance when using DirectX 12. Now this does vary from scene to scene, but here we're actually getting between 5 and around 20 FPS boost in frame rates. And that's a pretty big uptick in performance, especially if you're going to be targeting resolutions above 1080p. Now the difference isn't sustained in every scene, and there are times when, well, both APIs hand in similar results, but generally speaking there is a clear advantage when using DirectX 12 on AMD cards. So overall both cards are good enough to target 60 frames per second at 1080p, though it's worth pointing out that if you want to maintain an absolute solid lock, then well, the RX 480 does a much better job here, avoiding those frame rate drops below 60 FPS that do appear from time to time on the GTX 1060. In order to get the highest frame rates possible, then with Nvidia cards we suggest you use DirectX 11, whereas an AMD DirectX 12 gives us a much bigger performance boost for the red team. So that about wraps it up for now. If you enjoyed the analysis, don't forget to give us a like, and remember to subscribe if you want to support Digital Foundry. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.